I'd like you to imagine that you and I are a router. So a packet comes in, here it comes. And as we take a look at that packet at the IP header information, the layer 3 information, we look at the destination and then we look at our routing table and say, okay, how do we forward this packet in the right direction? Now, if you and I as a router don't have a specific match or a good match for that IP address, that destination, what are we going to do? Well, if we have a default route, we're going to use that. The default route, like the Obi-Wan Kenobi route. Help us, Obi-Wan. You're our last hope. And because there are millions of networks on the planet, it's important to have a default route so our router can forward it out and get that packet on its way. And in our skill on static routes, we identified how we can configure static default routes. But since we're running OSPF, a dynamic routing protocol, wouldn't it be better to be able to inject a default route into OSPF and dynamically have all the other routers learn it? The answer is absolutely yes. So in this video, I'd like to talk with you about the concepts and options we have about how to get a default route into OSPF so it can be shared across the OSPF area. And let's use this OSPF topology we've been playing with in the lab. Let's imagine that R1 off of this gig 00 interface, which is the 10.1 network. Let's imagine that we've got a service provider over here, an internet service provider, that's giving us access to the rest of the internet. So for R1, what we would want to have on R1 is a default route of some type. And there's a few ways that R1 could get a default route. Let's list them. So as far as getting a default route R1, we could statically configure it. And we've done that in a previous skill, a static default route. Or if R1 is dynamically learning an IP address from the service provider, maybe it's being dynamically assigned, maybe as part of a DHCP offering, where we supply a default route as part of the DHCP process. Or maybe we're running a routing protocol between ourselves and the service provider, and in that routing protocol, they are dynamically updating us with the information on a default route. So regardless of which method that R1 is using to have a default route, and let's imagine the service provider is at 10.1.0.99. So for R1's default route, which would look something like this for IPv4, we could set the next hop to 10.1.0.99. So regardless of how R1 got the default route, the next challenge is, how do we share that route dynamically with R2, R3, and R4 in OSPF? So to train R1 to inject that default route into OSPF so that R2 and R3 and R4 can all benefit from it, here's what we would do. On R1, we could go into router configuration mode. So router space OSPF space our process ID. We've been using 1 in the lab, so we'll continue that. We'll press enter. We're now in router configuration mode. And to tell R1, just like in kindergarten, it's good to share. What we would do to share that default information is use the command default information, which means share the information about your default route space originate, which tells R1 to take the action of injecting that into OSPF. So once the default route is in OSPF and it's shared through the link state advertisements, and R3 knows about it, and R2 knows about it, and R4 knows about it, and everybody knows about it, all these routers will have information in their routing table about a default route in the event they need to use it. Now this information, default-information space originate, is only going to be useful for getting a default route into OSPF starting here in R1 if, this is an important if R1 has a default route. Basically it's saying, I'm going to go ahead and put the default route in OSPF if I have one. So if R1 doesn't have a default route, it wasn't statically configured, it wasn't dynamically learned, nothing else. If it does not have a default route, it won't be adding it to OSPF. Now, there are some cases where we might say, you know what, Mr. R1, if something bad happens out here, I'm sorry about that, but regardless of whether or not you have a default route yourself, I'd like you to still inject it into OSPF. And to do that, we're going to add on this keyword right here, always. So this word always really should be called go ahead and add it anyway, even if you don't have a default route yourself. And that's it. That's all we have to do on one of our routers, hopefully the router that has a default route. We add this statement in router OSPF configuration mode, and that will dynamically add the default route to the rest of the topology. So with that single command, we can train R1 or any OSPF speaking router to inject or bring in a default route that can then be shared with the rest of the OSPF routers. So that's the concept. In the very next video, what we'll do is we'll take this topology, we'll open up the lab, and we'll implement and verify the injection of that default route in OSPF. So thanks for joining me in this video, and I'll see you in the very next one. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.